December 7th, 1941, a date that changed everything. But this isn't about Pearl Harbor. This is about what happened 3 months later in a small Australian coastal town that nobody remembers, where a woman who couldn't hear properly became the most unlikely hero of the Pacific War. Her name was Margaret Chen, and the mistake she made that rainy morning in March 1942 should have cost hundreds of lives. Instead, it saved them all. If you're enjoying this story, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. It really helps us bring you more incredible true stories from history. Margaret had been partially deaf since childhood, the result of scarlet fever that swept through Sydney's Chinatown when she was 7 years old. By 1942, at 31 years old, she had learned to navigate a world that wasn't built for her. She read lips better than most people read books. She felt vibrations through floors and walls. She noticed things that others missed because she had to pay attention differently. The Postal Service hired her in 1939, back when men still dominated every corner of the workforce. But then the war came, and suddenly there weren't enough men left to deliver the mail. Margaret became the postwoman for the northern districts of Darwin, a sweaty frontier town perched on Australia's vulnerable northern coast, closer to Jakarta than to Sydney, exposed and isolated. Darwin had transformed almost overnight after Pearl Harbor. The harbor filled with ships. American servicemen walked the streets alongside Australian soldiers. Everyone knew the Japanese were coming. It wasn't a question of if, but when. The town held its breath and waited. Margaret started her rounds at dawn every day, when the tropical heat was still bearable. She carried letters from mothers to sons, from wives to husbands, from sweethearts separated by thousands of miles of ocean. She knew which families were waiting for news, which houses went quiet when telegrams arrived with black borders. The military used civilian postal workers for low-level communication sometimes. Nothing classified, just routine messages between offices, supply requests, personnel transfers. Margaret delivered these too, riding her bicycle through streets that smelled of diesel fuel and fear. On March 19th, 1942, the morning started like any other. Margaret collected her delivery bag from the Central Post Office at 5:30. The sky was already lightening, heavy clouds promising rain. The humidity wrapped around everything like a wet blanket. She was sorting through her route assignments when Postal Supervisor Harold Davies approached her. Harold was 56, exempted from military service due to chronic asthma. He was a good man, patient with Margaret's deafness, always made sure to face her when speaking so she could read his lips. He handed her a sealed envelope. Military dispatch, low priority. Destination was the communication station at the harbor master's office. Harold's lips moved clearly as he spoke. Margaret caught most of it. Standard delivery, no rush. Before noon would be fine. But the post office was chaos that morning. 3 new workers, teenage girls barely trained, were trying to manage the sorting tables. Someone had knocked over a box of parcels. The noise didn't bother Margaret, but the confusion did. People moving quickly, faces turned away, lips impossible to read. Harold said something else to her, but a girl stepped between them at exactly the wrong moment. Margaret saw his lips move, caught fragments. Something about checking, something about confirming. She nodded automatically. She'd figure it out. The envelope felt ordinary in her hands. Brown paper, military seal, address written in careful block letters. Nothing suggested urgency. She tucked it into her bag, beneath a stack of personal letters, and started her route. Darwin was stirring to life. Shopkeepers swept their doorways. Military trucks rumbled past, carrying troops to their posts. The smell of fresh bread from Chen's bakery, run by her uncle's family, mixed with the ever-present odor of the harbor, salt and oil and fish. Margaret delivered mail to the residential streets first, as always. Mrs. Patterson, waiting anxiously for word from her son in New Guinea. The Morrison family, their eldest boy somewhere in the Coral Sea. The Yamada family, Japanese-Australians living under suspicion, their mail now monitored, their lives constrained by fear and prejudice. She worked methodically through her route, checking addresses, leaving letters in boxes, sometimes waiting when someone wanted to send a reply. The clouds grew heavier. Rain would come soon, the kind of downpour that turned streets into rivers. By 9:30, she'd covered half her route. The military dispatch sat in her bag, seemingly forgotten, but Margaret never forgot a delivery. She was saving it for last, as she always did with the harbor office, because it meant a nice ride along the waterfront where the breeze off the Timor Sea offered relief from the heat. At 10:15, she stopped at a small cafe near the Botanical Gardens. Mrs. Wu, the owner, always had tea ready for Margaret. They'd known each other for years, 2 Chinese-Australian women navigating a society that accepted them conditionally, tolerantly, but never quite completely. Mrs. Wu's son, Tommy, worked at the harbor as a radio operator. He was there that morning, home briefly between shifts. He looked exhausted, his face drawn with worry. Margaret couldn't hear their conversation, but she watched their lips, caught pieces. Tommy was talking about increased radio chatter, Japanese reconnaissance planes spotted farther south than usual, intelligence suggesting something big was being planned. Mrs. Wu looked frightened. She refilled Margaret's tea with shaking hands. Tommy glanced at his watch, said he needed to get back to the station. He left quickly, not bothering to finish his breakfast. The rain started at 10:45, fat drops that exploded on the pavement like small bombs. Margaret pulled a canvas tarp over her delivery bag and pedaled faster toward the harbor. The streets were emptying, people ducking into doorways and shops. She reached the harbor master's building at 11:20. The structure was 2 stories, concrete and timber, built to withstand cyclones. Sandbags were stacked around the entrance now. Sentries stood watch despite the rain. Margaret locked her bicycle and approached the entrance. The guard was young, maybe 19, his uniform already soaked. He recognized her, waved her through. She'd been here dozens of times before. Inside, the building hummed with activity. Officers moved between rooms, typewriters clattered. Somewhere a radio crackled with static and voices. Margaret felt the vibrations through the floor, the building alive with urgent purpose. She found the communication station on the 2nd floor. The door was open. Inside, 4 operators sat at radio equipment, headphones clamped over their ears. Tommy Wu was one of them, his back to the door, his hand moving quickly as he transcribed a message. Lieutenant Morrison, the officer in charge, was standing by the window, looking out at the rain-swept harbor. He turned when Margaret entered, surprised. She pulled the envelope from her bag and handed it to him. He glanced at it, then back at her, his lips moving quickly. Too quickly for Margaret to catch everything clearly. She saw frustration cross his face. Then he grabbed a pencil and paper. "When did you receive this?" he wrote. "This morning, before 6, Margaret wrote back. His face went pale. He tore open the envelope, read the contents, and suddenly everyone in the room was moving. Tommy spun in his chair. Morrison was shouting, though Margaret only saw his mouth forming words, his face urgent. Tommy ran to Margaret, gripped her shoulders. His lips formed words slowly, deliberately. "What time, exactly? What did Harold say?" Margaret felt confused, frightened by their reactions. He said before noon was fine, standard delivery. Tommy's eyes widened. He turned to Morrison, who was already at a telephone, cranking the handle frantically. Other operators were putting on their headphones, hands flying across their equipment. Margaret stood frozen, watching the chaos she'd apparently caused. Tommy came back to her, wrote quickly on the notepad. Harold said, "Immediate, not standard. This was urgent intelligence. Japanese bombers spotted on approach. We needed to scramble fighters." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She'd misread Harold's lips. In the confusion of the post office, in those few seconds when someone stepped between them, she'd missed the critical word. Immediate, not standard. Immediate. And now, because of her mistake, the warning had arrived hours late. Morrison slammed down the telephone. He wrote on a paper for Margaret. "No time for fighters. They're 30 minutes out. We need to evacuate the harbor now." But then something strange happened. Morrison stopped, stared at the paper in his hand, the original dispatch Margaret had delivered. He read it again, checked his watch, looked out the window at the harbor where dozens of ships sat at anchor, where hundreds of men were working, unaware. He called Tommy over. They spoke quickly, faces intense. Then Morrison did something unexpected. He started writing orders, his hand moving fast across the paper. Tommy ran to the radio equipment, began broadcasting. The other operators joined in, sending messages on different frequencies. Margaret watched, not understanding. If the Japanese bombers were coming, why weren't they evacuating? Why were they sending radio messages? Tommy glanced back at her once, his face showing something that might have been hope or might have been desperate fear. At 11:48, air raid sirens began to wail across Darwin. Margaret couldn't hear them, but she felt the vibration, saw through the window as people began running toward shelters. Ships in the harbor started moving, but slowly, too slowly to escape if bombers were truly minutes away. Morrison wrote another note for Margaret. "Stay here, away from windows." She was shaking now, the weight of her mistake crushing her. How many men would die because she'd misread a simple word? How many ships would be destroyed? All her fault. All because she was deaf and couldn't hear properly and had no business doing a job that required perfect communication. 12:03. Margaret watched the clock on the wall, each second in agony. The operators were still at their stations, still broadcasting. What were they saying? What good were radio messages now? 12:15. No bombers appeared. The sky remained heavy with rain clouds, but empty of aircraft. Morrison stood at the window, binoculars raised, scanning the northern horizon. 12:30. Still nothing. The all-clear sirens sounded. Margaret felt them through the building's frame. In the harbor, ships stopped their frantic preparations. Men emerged from shelters, looking confused. Morrison turned from the window. His face was unreadable. He approached Margaret, and she braced herself for anger, for blame, for everything she deserved. Instead, he wrote on his notepad, his hand steady. "Your late delivery may have saved hundreds of lives." Margaret stared at the words, not understanding. Tommy came over, added his own message. The dispatch contained coordinates and timing for Japanese bombers. Because you delayed it, we received the information at a different time. When we cross-referenced with our morning reconnaissance reports and current intelligence, we realized the coordinates were wrong, off by nearly 40 miles. Morrison wrote more. Intelligence suspected for weeks that the Japanese might be feeding us false information through a compromised source. Your delay, combined with the timing discrepancy, gave us the pattern we needed to confirm it. The coordinates in this dispatch were deliberately incorrect. If we'd scrambled fighters to those positions, our planes would have been out of position when the real attack came. Margaret read the words 3 times, trying to make sense of them. Tommy continued writing. We used the false coordinates to reverse engineer the likely real position. We broadcast warnings to our patrol aircraft in that area instead. They intercepted a Japanese reconnaissance flight, shot it down before it could confirm final targeting. Without that confirmation, the bomber squadron couldn't proceed. They turned back. Morrison's final note read, "Your mistake forced us to think differently about the intelligence. If you'd delivered it on time, we would have trusted it completely. By the time we realized it was false, it would have been too late." Margaret sat down, her legs suddenly unable to hold her. The room around her continued its work, operators returning to their regular duties, the crisis averted. But she couldn't move, couldn't process what she was being told. She had made a mistake, a real, significant mistake. She had misread Harold's lips, had delayed an urgent dispatch by hours. Every protocol said that was wrong, dangerous, potentially catastrophic. But sometimes, in war, being wrong in the right way could be more valuable than being right. Her mistake had created a pause, a moment of doubt, a chance to see the pattern that would have been invisible in the rush of doing everything correctly. Tommy brought her tea. He sat beside her and wrote another note. "They're recommending you for a commendation. Harold already confirmed the communication confusion at the post office. Nobody's blaming you." But Margaret was shaking her head. She wrote back, "I made a mistake. I should have been more careful. I should have asked Harold to repeat himself." Morrison came over, read what she'd written. He took the pencil and wrote, "In intelligence work, paranoia saves lives. Your delay gave us permission to be paranoid about information we wanted to trust. Sometimes, the best intelligence officers are the ones who make us question our assumptions." The rain had stopped. Through the window, Margaret could see sunshine breaking through the clouds, casting light across the harbor where ships sat safely at anchor, where men went about their work, alive and unharmed because a deaf postwoman had misread a simple word in a chaotic post office. Over the following weeks, Margaret learned more about what had happened. The Japanese had indeed been planning a major bombing raid on Darwin, intending to destroy the harbor and the ships there, but intelligence was a chess game of deception and counter-deception. Both sides played with information as their most valuable weapon. The Allies had suspected for months that they had a security leak somewhere in the Pacific communications network. Information was getting to the Japanese too easily, but they couldn't identify the source, couldn't be certain which intelligence was compromised. The dispatch Margaret delivered had been part of a controlled test, sent through a suspected compromised channel containing coordinates that were close to accurate but deliberately wrong. If the Japanese acted on those coordinates, it would confirm the leak. If they didn't, it might mean the channel was still secure. Margaret's delay had changed the timing equation. When Morrison received the dispatch late, it forced him to cross-check against other intelligence sources. The pattern of subtle discrepancies became visible only because he had time to look for it. Within 2 weeks, military intelligence had identified the leak, a Japanese-American translator working in Hawaii who had been coerced into cooperation through threats to family members still in Japan. He was quietly removed from his position, turned into a double agent, feeding controlled misinformation back to his handlers. The bombing raid never came. The Japanese squadron, without confirmation of updated targeting from their reconnaissance aircraft, Margaret and the harbor operators had helped intercept, returned to base. They tried again 3 weeks later, but by then Darwin's defenses were reinforced. The harbor was prepared, and the attack was repelled with heavy Japanese losses. Margaret never spoke publicly about her role in any of this. The military commendation was classified, filed away in archives that wouldn't be opened for 50 years. She continued delivering mail through Darwin, riding her bicycle through streets that grew busier as the war intensified, carrying letters that held the hopes and fears of families separated by war. But something changed in how people looked at her. The postal workers at the central office, who had sometimes grown impatient with her deafness, who had occasionally treated her as less capable because she couldn't hear properly, began to show her a different kind of respect. Harold Davies made sure to always face her directly when speaking, took extra time to ensure clear communication, but also trusted her judgment in ways he hadn't before. Tommy Wu visited her sometimes at Mrs. Wu's cafe, between his shifts at the communication station. He never talked about his work, classified information that Margaret wasn't cleared to know, but he listened when she talked about her delivery routes, about the families she saw every day, about the small observations she made because she had learned to notice things others missed. In June of 1942, the Postal Service offered Margaret a position at the Central Sorting Office, an indoor job with better pay, recognition of her years of service. She turned it down. She preferred the streets, the direct connection with the people she served, the sense of purpose that came from placing letters directly into the hands of people who needed them. The war continued. Darwin was bombed multiple times over the following year, 64 separate air raids before the Japanese threat finally diminished. Margaret delivered mail through all of it, learning the rhythms of the air raid sirens she couldn't hear, reading the faces of the people around her, knowing when to seek shelter and when it was safe to continue her route. She saw families receive terrible news, telegrams with black borders announcing that sons and husbands would never return home. She saw the same families receive letters written weeks before those deaths, final words from men who didn't know they were writing their last goodbyes. She treated every letter as if it carried the weight of lives within it, because often they did. In 1945, when the war finally ended, Darwin held celebrations in the streets. Margaret stood in the crowd watching people dance and cry and embrace. She felt the vibrations of music she couldn't hear, saw the joy on faces that had been tense with fear for so long. She thought about that March morning in 1942, about the mistake that wasn't really a mistake, about how sometimes being different, being unable to hear properly, being forced to read information in other ways could lead to seeing patterns that others missed. Years later, when the military documents were finally declassified and the story began to emerge, a historian found Margaret living quietly in Sydney. She was 73 years old, retired from the Postal Service, spending her days tending a small garden and volunteering at a school for deaf children. The historian asked her if she felt like a hero. Margaret shook her head. She wrote on a notepad, her handwriting still clear and steady, "I made a mistake. Other people were smart enough to see how that mistake could reveal something important. Real heroes don't make mistakes. They do their jobs perfectly when perfection matters most." But the historian disagreed. He had studied the intelligence reports, the communication logs, the cascade of decisions that followed from that delayed dispatch. He wrote back to her, "Sometimes courage looks like doing your job the best you can with the abilities you have, even when the world isn't built for you. Sometimes intelligence looks like creating space for doubt in a system that demands certainty. You did both." Margaret kept the commendation in a drawer, still classified even after declassification, still something she rarely talked about. What mattered to her more were the letters she'd delivered over 4 years of war, thousands of connections maintained between people separated by violence and fear, small threads of humanity preserved in the chaos. She remembered the faces of the families on her route, the way their expressions changed when she arrived. Hope and dread mixed together because mail could bring either comfort or devastation. She remembered the weight of letters in her bag, the responsibility of making sure each one reached its destination, that no message was lost or delayed, except for that one time when delay turned out to be exactly what was needed. In 2003, the Australian government officially recognized Margaret's service with a posthumous award presented to her niece at a small ceremony in Canberra. The citation mentioned her years of dedicated postal service during wartime, her reliability and commitment to her community. It didn't mention the specific incident in March of 1942, still too sensitive even 60 years later, but those who knew understood what was really being honored. Her story became a footnote in military intelligence textbooks, an example of how unconventional thinking and accidental deviation from protocol could sometimes reveal patterns that rigid adherence to procedure would miss. But it was more than that. It was a story about the value of different perspectives, about how someone the world saw as disabled brought unique abilities that saved lives. Margaret Chen never saw herself as disabled. She was deaf in a world built for hearing people, but she had learned to navigate that world with skills and observations that hearing people never developed. She noticed vibrations, read expressions, paid attention to details that others overlooked because they relied on sounds she couldn't hear. That morning in March 1942, in a chaotic post office where someone stepped between her and her supervisor at exactly the wrong or exactly the right moment, her deafness led to a misunderstanding. But that misunderstanding created space for doubt, for questioning, for seeing patterns in intelligence that would have been trusted too quickly if delivered on time. War is full of stories about heroes who did everything perfectly, who succeeded through skill and courage and determination. This is a different kind of story. This is about someone who made a mistake, who failed to do her job according to protocol, and whose failure became the key to preventing a disaster. Sometimes the most important intelligence comes not from perfect information perfectly delivered, but from imperfect information that arrives in ways that make us question what we think we know. Sometimes the heroes are the ones who make us slow down, doubt, verify, think twice before committing to action based on intelligence that seems too convenient, too perfectly timed. Margaret died in 2001 at age 90 in a nursing home in Sydney, surrounded by family who knew her as a grandmother who grew beautiful roses and volunteered with deaf children and never talked much about the war. They knew she'd been a postwoman in Darwin, that she'd stayed through the bombing raids, that she'd been commended for her service. They didn't know about the delayed dispatch, about the false coordinates, about the bombing raid that never happened because someone misread someone else's lips on a chaotic morning in March. But the children she taught at the deaf school carried forward her legacy in ways she never quantified. She taught them that being deaf wasn't a limitation, but a different way of experiencing the world, that the skills they developed to navigate a hearing world were valuable and unique, that paying attention differently meant noticing things others missed. And in military intelligence archives and classified reports gradually being opened to researchers, analysts still study the Darwin incident as a case study in the importance of questioning information, of allowing space for doubt, of recognizing that sometimes mistakes reveal truths that perfect execution would miss. The weeks following the incident brought subtle changes to Margaret's daily routine. Harold Davies implemented new procedures at the post office specifically designed to accommodate her deafness. A small lamp system was installed at her sorting station, red for urgent military dispatches, green for standard mail, yellow for packages requiring signatures. Other postal workers were instructed to always face Margaret when speaking, to write down critical information, to never assume she had heard announcements made to the room at large. These changes weren't made with fanfare or public acknowledgement of what had happened. Harold simply explained them as efficiency improvements, ways to reduce errors across the entire postal system. But Margaret understood. The military had likely spoken to him, explained in classified terms that clear communication protocols could be the difference between life and death. She also noticed that her delivery route was adjusted. More military facilities were added, fewer residential streets. At first, she wondered if this was punishment, taking away the personal connections she valued most. But Tommy Wu explained it differently one afternoon at his mother's cafe. "They trust you more now, not less," he wrote on their usual notepad. "Military dispatches need someone who pays attention to details, who doesn't just deliver the envelope, but notices if something seems off. You read situations differently than hearing people. That's valuable." Margaret wasn't entirely convinced. She still remembered the terror of that morning, the crushing weight of thinking her mistake had doomed hundreds of men. But she accepted the new route, learned the booked locations of every military office, communication station, and supply depot in the Darwin area. The Japanese bombers did eventually come to Darwin, just not when or where the false intelligence had suggested. On February 19th, 1942, just a month before Margaret's incident, Darwin had already suffered its first devastating air raid. Over 200 people died that day. Ships were sunk in the harbor. The town was shattered. Margaret had been delivering mail that morning, too. She'd been on the northern residential streets when the attack began. She didn't hear the air raid sirens, didn't hear the bombs falling, but she felt the ground shaking beneath her bicycle, saw the massive columns of black smoke rising from the harbor, watched people running in panic through the streets. She'd helped an elderly couple, the Robertsons, get to a shelter. Mr. Robertson was nearly blind. His wife used a cane. They moved slowly while the world exploded around them. Margaret got them to safety in a reinforced building basement, then went back out to help others. She pulled a young mother and her 2 children from a collapsed storefront, the woman bleeding from flying glass but alive. That day had taught Margaret something about herself. When crisis came, her deafness didn't make her less capable. It made her differently capable. She didn't freeze in panic at sounds of destruction because she couldn't hear them. She focused on what she could see, what she could feel, what needed to be done right in front of her. The military had noticed. Several officers had witnessed her calm efficiency during the chaos, her ability to navigate danger without the auditory panic that gripped others. That was likely why they trusted her with military mail afterward, why they didn't remove her from duty when her disability could have been used as an excuse. By April of 1942, Darwin had become a fortress. Anti-aircraft guns lined the harbor. Fighter planes patrolled constantly. Civilian population had been evacuated down to a skeleton crew of essential workers. Margaret was among them, one of only 3 postal workers who remained to handle military and essential civilian correspondence. The town felt ghostly now. Streets that had bustled with life were empty except for military vehicles. Shops were closed, windows boarded up. The tropical beauty of the place, the bright flowers and lush vegetation, seemed incongruous against the sandbags and barbed wire. as if nature and war existed in different realities overlapping the same space. Margaret lived in a small apartment near the post office, sharing the building with 2 nurses and a radio technician. They formed an unlikely family, 4 women keeping Darwin functioning while bombs fell intermittently, and everyone waited for the next attack. They cooked together when rations allowed, shared news and rumors, comforted each other through the fears that came with every sunset. Well, one of the nurses, Elizabeth Kearney, learned basic sign language to communicate with Margaret. She checked out a book from the library before it closed, practiced the hand signs every evening. It was a kindness Margaret had rarely experienced, someone taking time to enter her world rather than always forcing her to adapt to theirs. They would sit on the apartment's small balcony in the evenings when no air raids threatened, Elizabeth signing slowly while Margaret corrected her form, teaching her the nuances of a language that used hands and expressions instead of sound. They talked about their families, about the men they'd loved or hoped to love, about what they'd do when the war finally ended. Elizabeth was engaged to a sailor named Patrick, serving on a destroyer somewhere in the Coral Sea. She hadn't received a letter in 6 weeks. Every day she asked Margaret with desperate hope if anything had come. Every day Margaret had to shake her head, watching her friend's face fall. Then one morning in May, a letter arrived. Margaret recognized the handwriting on the envelope, the careful script that Elizabeth had shown her in previous letters. She delivered it immediately, interrupting her route to bring it to the hospital where Elizabeth was working. Elizabeth's hand shook as she opened it. She read it twice, tears streaming down her face, then signed to Margaret with trembling fingers. "He's alive. He's safe. He still loves me." These were the moments that mattered to Margaret, more than any commendation or recognition. The ability to connect people across impossible distances, to carry words that meant everything to someone waiting in fear and hope. Every letter she delivered was a small victory against the isolation and terror that war inflicted. The military dispatches she carried were different, but equally important. Most were routine, supply requests and personnel transfers, but occasionally she delivered sealed envelopes marked with high-priority classifications, envelopes that officers opened with grave faces, reading contents that would shape strategies and decisions she'd never know about. She wondered sometimes if any of those dispatches were tests, like the one in March. Were the military intelligence officers still running experiments, still trying to identify compromised communication channels? Was her role as unwitting participant in their security protocols ongoing? Tommy Wu hinted once that this might be the case. He'd been promoted to a senior position in the communications unit, privy to information he could never discuss. But he wrote cryptically on their notepad one day, "Sometimes the most secure way to send information is through channels that seem too simple to be strategic. A postwoman on a bicycle is harder to intercept than an encrypted radio transmission." Margaret understood. She was invisible in a way that made her valuable. The Japanese might monitor radio frequencies, might have spies watching military facilities, but who would pay attention to a deaf woman delivering mail? She was background, overlooked, dismissed as unimportant. Except she wasn't unimportant. She was a piece in a larger intelligence puzzle, carrying information that might be genuine or might be bait. Her routes and timing potentially part of elaborate deception operations she'd never fully understand. It was exhausting sometimes, carrying the weight of significance she couldn't quite measure. Every delivery might matter critically or might be meaningless, and she had no way to know which was which. All she could do was her job, deliver every piece of mail with equal care, pay attention to the details, notice things that seemed out of place. In July of 1942, she noticed something odd. A new officer had appeared at one of the communication stations, a Lieutenant Williams who seemed nervous when she delivered dispatches to him. His hands trembled slightly when he took envelopes from her. His eyes darted around as if checking whether anyone was watching. Margaret mentioned it to Tommy, writing down her observations. Tommy's expression turned serious. He told her to keep delivering mail to Williams normally, to note anything else unusual, but to be careful. He didn't explain further, and Margaret didn't ask. Some things were better not knowing. 3 weeks later, Lieutenant Williams was quietly transferred away from Darwin. Margaret never learned what happened to him, whether he was a security risk or just a young man cracking under the pressure of war. But Tommy thanked her afterward, wrote that her observations had been helpful, that paying attention to small details of human behavior was a skill that couldn't be taught from manuals. The war ground on. Months became years. Darwin absorbed more bombing raids, though none as devastating as the first. The Allies gradually pushed Japanese forces back across the Pacific. News of battles won and lost filtered through military channels, censored and delayed, but slowly the sense of desperate defense shifted toward cautious optimism. Margaret watched her reflection in mirrors and noticed herself aging in accelerated ways. The stress and fear etched lines around her eyes. Her hair, which had been solid black when the war started, now showed streaks of gray. She was only 34 in 1943, but she felt decades older. Yet she also felt stronger somehow, more certain of her own value. The world had told her throughout her life that her deafness was a limitation, something to be overcome or accommodated, but the war had taught her that different abilities had different values in different contexts. What seemed like a disability in peacetime communication could be an asset in wartime intelligence work. She wasn't the only one learning this lesson. The military was recruiting code talkers, using indigenous languages that Japanese intelligence couldn't decipher. They were using women for intelligence analysis, finding that female analysts noticed patterns that male analysts missed. They were discovering that diversity in perspectives and abilities created resilience in systems, that homogeneous thinking was vulnerable to exploitation. Margaret represented a small part of this larger shift. One deaf postwoman whose unique way of processing information had accidentally revealed an intelligence trap. But she was part of a broader recognition that the skills war required weren't always the skills peacetime societies valued most highly. By 1944, the threat to Darwin had diminished significantly. Japanese forces were in retreat across the Pacific. The military presence in town remained heavy, but the constant tension eased slightly. Some civilian families began returning, shops reopened. The post office started handling personal mail in volumes approaching pre-war levels. Margaret's route expanded again to include residential areas. She reconnected with families she'd known before the evacuations. Mrs. Patterson's son had survived New Guinea and was recovering in a hospital in Brisbane. The Morrison boy had died at sea, but his parents had received his last letters and found some comfort in his final words. The Yamada family had been interned despite their Australian citizenship, their house standing empty and vandalized, a shameful reminder of fear-driven injustice. The mail she delivered now included victory letters, announcements of births to parents who'd left as newlyweds years before, wedding invitations for ceremonies postponed repeatedly by war. The emotional tenor was shifting from fear and grief toward hope and rebuilding, though the losses were permanent and the scars would never fully heal. Elizabeth married her sailor Patrick in January of 1945. Margaret was maid of honor, standing beside her friend in a simple ceremony at the small Catholic church that had survived the bombings. Patrick was on leave for 2 weeks, thin and worn but alive and present. They held each other as if afraid to let go, as if separation might come again at any moment. The wedding was a small moment of joy in the larger darkness, a reminder that life continued despite war's attempts to destroy it. Margaret watched them exchange vows, watched Patrick sign, "I love you," in the hand language Elizabeth had learned, watched her friend's face glow with happiness that had seemed impossible during the darkest months of 1942. In August of 1945, the war ended. The announcement came through radio broadcasts that Margaret couldn't hear, but she saw the reactions around her, people crying and embracing and laughing in the streets. Japan had surrendered. After 6 years of global war, after millions of deaths and unimaginable destruction, it was finally over. Darwin celebrated with the rest of Australia, though the town's celebrations were quieter than most, tempered by the weight of everything that had happened there. Too many people had died in those bombing raids. Too much had been destroyed. The victory was real, but so were the losses. The story of a deaf postwoman who misheard a code and accidentally stopped a Japanese bombing raid is really a story about value hiding in unexpected places, about skills that a rigid world might dismiss as disabilities, revealing themselves as precisely the abilities needed in moments of crisis, about the complex, unpredictable nature of war, where perfection can be dangerous and mistakes can save lives. Margaret never wanted to be called a hero. She saw herself as someone who made a mistake and was fortunate that other people were smart enough to use that mistake productively. But perhaps that humility, that understanding of her own limitations and the importance of other people's contributions, was itself a kind of wisdom that the world needed more of. In the end, the question isn't whether Margaret Chen was a hero. The question is what we mean by heroism in the first place. If a hero is someone who does extraordinary things through perfect skill and courage, then perhaps she wasn't one. But if a hero is someone who keeps doing their job the best they can with the abilities they have, who maintains human connections in inhuman circumstances, who accidentally creates space for wisdom by failing to be perfect, then maybe she was the most important kind of hero, the kind we don't recognize until much later, the kind whose contributions are invisible until someone takes the time to trace the patterns backward and realize that everything, somehow, depended on a moment of ordinary human imperfection.